politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. I'm joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Welcome to the show, Ken.
It's great to be back, Trey.
Well, Ken, I'm actually going to be selfish just for a couple of moments as we get the show going, because some of our listeners actually might know this individual, Dr. John Maple. He died on Thursday night, this evening, after a protracted battle with cancer. Dr. Maple, he was actually the reason, Ken, that I came to Oklahoma Christian University. He was the former chair of the History and Political Science Department here. And he's a huge reason, why I'm here and I'm doing what I am today. And it was really kind of deeply humbling today for me when I got to take over for him 2 years ago. And then today when I found out that he had passed away. And it was particularly ironic because it was the same day in the same location, only I was sitting on the other side of the table that he was making some very cogent arguments why I should uproot my life again and move to Oklahoma. And so for those of you who are listening, who I know you come from around the area of Oklahoma or connections with OC, I know that you too will sadly be missing Dr. John Maple. John, I wish you were still sitting in this seat because then you'd be dealing with all the paperwork. But no, I mean that honest. But Ken, what I do want to move on to is our big story. And I think one of the biggest stories that came out of this last week, and I think we're going to be talking about this for some time, and that's the battle between I'm going to call it the Republican Civil War. And it's taken the form this past week of a couple of statements. One from Mitch McConnell on the Senate floor turned into an op-ed, and then from a statement from Trump about McConnell. And I'm going to be honest, I actually have a dog in this fight. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But so while I disagree with McConnell on a lot of things, I think he is right here. So here's what was said. Here's what went down. On the floor of the Senate, McConnell argued that Americans beat and bloodied their own police and attacked Congress because, quote, they had been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth because he was angry he'd lost an election, end quote. He would go on to say on the Senate floor that Trump, quote, practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of that day, end quote. He'd also go on and say that, quote, the leader of the free world cannot spend weeks thundering that shadowy forces are stealing our country and then feign surprise when people believe him and do reckless things, end quote. So Trump is kind of then shot back and argued that the Republican Party is never going to be respected or strong again as long as, quote unquote, leaders like McConnell are at the helm. In Trump's own words from his statement, he said, "We know our America First agenda is a winner, not McConnell's Beltway First agenda or Biden's America Last." He would go on to blast him, meaning McConnell, for losing Georgia, for not being willing to issue $2,000 checks, is what he argues handed Georgia to the Democrat. And then in the line that has been making the rounds in the news, he noted Mitch is a dour, sullen, and unsmiling political hack. And if Republican senators are going to stay with him, they will not win again. Now that's some pretty strong words there, Ken. Now I'm going to turn it over to you, but I do want to say just one thing into this because again I have a bit to fight here, and that's to say that if Trump, if he was listening, and I know he's not, that my response to this little bit of statement he has here is Trump, he's the embarrassment. He's been the embarrassment to the conservative and libertarian alliance. that has always held together the Republican Party. And more than any other single person has shaken my fundamental belief of myself as a Republican. And so I think Trump is the one who created a tent that has included some of the most despicable groups, including neo-Nazis, and trying to bring them, and successfully in many cases, into the party. And I think that Trump's going to go down without question in history along the likes of Andrew Jackson as the worst president in American history. So I've been pretty clear on where I stand, but Ken, what do you think about this ongoing Republican war and what it might mean for party realignment, for politics in the upcoming 2022 midterm elections? What do you think about this? I mean, this is some pretty intense public feuding.
Yeah, well, first, I just got to first say, did you mean Andrew Johnson? Andrew Jackson is still on the $20 bill. Some people think he's a good president.
Listen, if you mass genocide people, you're going to have to be in my book down just a little bit. So he's on the $20 bill, but I have, listen, he is the single-handed cause for how many countless of a genocide. I mean, I can't get over that one. So I did mean him. Johnson is bad. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to suggest that Johnson was a great president.
No,
but
I didn't, because he's not my president, that's for sure. But I would have ranked probably Andrew Johnson or James Buchanan even a little lower. So I think Trump, he's certainly going to be thought of in that breath. Well, in terms of civil war, it's a pretty one-sided war because I think McConnell has absolutely no interest in even engaging in whatever war is going on at all. He has not responded. He's not going to respond.
He doesn't need to respond.
He doesn't need to respond. He doesn't. I think he has said he's never going to speak to Trump again, and he's probably never going to speak of Trump again. He's just this nonsense has no impact on McConnell at all. I mean, even the idea that Trump says he's going to primary McConnell. Well, I mean, McConnell just got reelected to a 6-year term in 2020. If he wants to run again in 2026, when he's about 85 years old, Trump's going to be in no position to do anything about primarying him. I mean,
as a matter of fact, for a little bit of inside baseball, this past week, McConnell had actually signaled to Kentucky lawmakers that he'd like to see the rules for how senators are replaced if they leave midterm changed, so that governors would actually be picking from a list of 3 or a shorter list that's given to them, in large part because, of course, the current governor of Kentucky is from the opposite party of Mitch McConnell, which might signal something right there about along the lines of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I saw that, but actually I don't expect McConnell to voluntarily resign or retire before the end of his 6-year term. I think he, I interpret that. I do probably agree it means he's not going to run again, but I would interpret that as just McConnell is always, dotting his I's, crossing his T's, worried about, hanging on to the Senate seats that are there. And I think he's actually pushing that advice on a lot of other states as well. That if there are states where there's gubernatorial appointments to fill vacancies, if there's a Democratic governor, I think he's just generally, being his usual strategic, tactical self and saying we got to make sure that a Democratic governor can't possibly choose a Democratic interim senator to fill a vacancy. So I don't think he's actually signaling that he's planning to leave early or that he thinks Rand Paul is going to leave early. But yeah, McConnell, I mean, he's in a complete catbird seat to totally ignore Trump. I mean, I think to the extent that there's any civil war at all, even though I think McConnell is absurdly stronger than Trump in every possible respect, the one thing is there could be a civil war amongst the electorate, because it probably is true that Trump voters are a more numerous faction now in the Republican Party than the type of voters that we would have thought of previously as establishment Republican voters. So that's something that could go in a lot of different directions going forward. But I don't know that Trump or Trumpism is well organized enough to seriously mount a serious attack on the party leadership. And I don't actually know that there are any successors to Trump out there that, even though people like Hawley and Cruz are trying to kind of position themselves that way, I don't think those kind of people have much appeal to Trump's actual voters. So I don't really know how to read all that. What do you think?
I mean, it's funny because we don't often disagree. I think we actually have a shade of disagreement, but not in the way that I would have imagined we would. And I think that you're underestimating I don't disagree when you call the Trump supporters disorganized, and I know what you mean by that. In other words, they don't have a systematic way of pushing the party forward. But I think you need to be careful, and you were hinting at it when you said, well, what about the electorate? But of course, the individuals who are going to be coming into the party, I mean, well, look at Green. Look at Representative Green. I don't think that in a pre-Trump universe, you're going to have a Green in office. And so I'm a little bit more concerned that more traditional Republicans, i.e. that conservative libertarian alliance that we've long had that I mentioned earlier, I think that really is going to have to fight to remain the bulwark of the Republican Party. The idea that I think Trump is going to go away, I think, has been overplayed by many of us who are just tired of him.
I get that. I don't completely disagree with that, but I just would see it maybe slightly differently. You're right, of course, that someone like a Marjorie Taylor Greene is only possible because of Trump, and she's not going to be the only one of her type. In fact, she's already not the only one of her type. There's Congresswoman Boebert from Colorado is kind of that type now. There's a few, but I think in all but the tiniest handful of states, if a candidate like that ran statewide, they would not be able to win, right? So that to the extent that Trumpism
you sound like me in 2015 thinking that Trump couldn't win.
Yeah, well, Trump had a sort of advantage. I suppose one thing that Trump had going for him, besides the fact that he was a TV celebrity with a fair amount of charisma, and also that he got to run in a field that was absurdly crowded, so a lot of the other candidates were splitting the vote on each other, was that I think, and maybe this is built into what you just said, that the Republican Party electorate, it's really been some time since they were all that conservative by conventional measures of conservatism. Mm-hmm. And you might say when they nominated George W. Bush in 2000, he really probably was the most conservative candidate, or a very conservative candidate that Republicans could choose. But then if you look from 2008, 2012, 2016, so you get McCain, Romney, Trump, they don't have a lot in common with each other, but what those three have in common with each other is that every single one of them was the least conservative candidate in the primary. And so I think there is this, there is this sense that the Republican Party has sort of been built by the conservative movement, but the Republican Party electorate isn't really, all that animated or motivated by that conservative movement. And they're animated or motivated by different things. And, Trumpism, I think to the country's great detriment, kind of latched on racism and nativism, and to some extent sexism, as things that could excite a big chunk of voters who really didn't care about conservative movement issues.
I think you need to include in that there's a lot of economic voters in there. And I think one of the things that individuals like myself did not successfully see, and I'll be straight about that, is I think there were a lot of conservatives Republicans, not conservatives. I think there were a number of Republican voters who saw expanding international trade as being an economic harm. And so I don't disagree what you're saying about kind of that nativism. I think part of it is also not just tied up in terms of culture, but I think there's some underlying economic unease there in a global economy and in recognizing advantages of countries trading. And I think that's a big portion of what made Trump successful. As a matter of fact, on the left, I think that's what is a large part of what makes Bernie Sanders successful. I see a lot of similarities between the two, at least on that one particular item.
I wonder about it. I mean, you certainly could be right about that, and I'm just really going with a gut feeling here more than anything that could refute what you just said. But I would look at that more like the motivations. So it's true that people who oppose free trade might support Trump or they might support Sanders. But my gut instinct and my kind of interactions with people in that camp is that of people who oppose free trade, if you're going to try to figure out, well, which of them are going to be the ones that support Trump and which are going to be the ones that support Sanders, it really feels to me like the ones who support Trump, they start from the position of nativism, so that what they don't like about free trade really has very little to do with economics. It's only just that they don't like the interaction with foreigners. They don't like the influence of foreigners.
I will agree with you there. I think what distinguishes it is the two things get tied together, right? That ideas of economics and culture merge into almost a singular ideological position. So I don't. I think it's overlap. I think it's overlap more than single ideological, because I do think the Sanders people who are against free trade, their issue is that they think it weakened the labor unions in the United States. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of. They're not really coming at it from an ideology of nativism. In fact, I think a lot of them would be fine with free trade if it could be accompanied by an international labor movement, so that it didn't weaken unions. So I think the impact on unionized labor, organized labor, I think is the primary concern for the Sanders voters. And I think just the idea that, we're actually involved with foreigners seems to me more kind of atavistic rather than economic, in terms of why that's an issue for the Trump voters. Well, one of the other things that came out of this Civil War, and I've, this has been something that I have been kind of gelling and journaling about a little bit, but I really wasn't quite sure how to put it into words until I think this week. And this is a question for you, Ken, because I think it really has to be answered from the Democrats. And that is, I think that Democrats, more so than they're showing, need to be worried about this Republican Civil War. And here's why, and this is what I've been having time trying to come to thinking about this, is you kind of go back in history and you think to the era of good feelings, the last time we really had one dominant political party. And I could see in the short term maybe something like that being the case in the wake of Trump, where Republicans are not able to put forward effective candidates, in part because we're divided among ourselves. But here's where it kind of then comes for you, Ken, and I worry a little bit about this because we really need robust political discourse. I mean, that's one of the underlying principles of this show. And one of the things I've kind of noticed as we've moved forward, maybe just a touch, and I'm curious about your take, is that I fear that a lot of Democrats or a lot of leftists who I think have rightly assailed Trumpism, and I've been on board with them for that, might be falling into a discourse now where there could be no loyal opposition. In other words, you're rightfully attacking an individual and a system of values that is antithetical to Republican government. But then at some point, how do Democrats work to ensure that there's kind of a robust political party system where they can have positive discourse and disagree with the party while at the same time kind of being able to back away from the very successful language and the rightful language of assailing individuals like Trump? And I'm thinking about this in terms most recently as I've seen some of the tweets coming from Democratic congresspersons in the past week. And that's kind of what gelled it for me here for you, Ken. So what do you think about that? So kind of what do Democrats need to think about the Republican Civil War and that kind of language shift if we can move away from a Trump?
Yeah, well, I guess I agree with part of your diagnosis, but maybe not quite with the prescription. So, okay. So I think it will if there's a lot of instability in the Republican Party, and if kind of Trumpist groups perhaps aligned with the kind of militias that we've seen, including, I think, some of the militia groups that attacked the Capitol, and that becomes kind of a rump part of the Republican Party or just spins off into a different party or takes over the Republican Party. I think that those kinds of groups getting the control of one of our great political parties definitely does pose a lot of danger to the stability of the country. So I certainly agree with that. On the other hand, if you could hypothesize, that differently, and I think this was implicit in your question, maybe what happens isn't that violent militias take over the Republican Party, but maybe what happens is just that the Republican Party can't hold together as a viable party, and so Democrats, for a while become so dominant that we don't have a functioning two-party system. Well, actually, that wouldn't bother me, and I think that sort of is what happens.
So when you say, in other words, just having a Democratic Party, a single-party system, wouldn't bother you. I'm a little surprised to hear you that.
Yeah, it would not bother me. I actually
you've mentioned before on the show how you think that political systems are best done when you can have. I was even trying to use your words as I was asking. You've oftentimes talked about the loyal opposition. So I'm a little surprised about that.
I do believe that, but I think it's not a question of best. It's a question of second best right now, right? So, the best of all would be a well-functioning two-party system. But I'll stand by that. I've said it before. I'll say it again. And I know that's where your question was coming from. But I think we're in a world of second best right now. And if the question is, we have a two-party system right now where, in fact, the Senate's divided 50-50, the House is closely divided. But I see that, under current political circumstances, that's not so good because you have, it doesn't give you the chance of achieving any kind of bipartisan accomplishments if you've got such extreme polarization, not only among the elected officials, but actually being demanded by their constituents, that the opposition party sees its only goal as to make the majority party a failure, and therefore to not to try to make deals with them about anything, not to find points of mutual agreement or mutual interest, but just to sabotage to the maximum extent possible any kind of achievements that could be good for the country. I think that's the position we're actually in right now, and so I think from that it would actually move the country forward to eliminate that kind of dysfunction by having a period where one party was more dominant. And I do think if you look at the 1930s and into the early 1940s, where the country really wasn't able to deal with the Great Depression properly until you had basically significant one-party rule, and probably couldn't have dealt with World War II properly if we didn't have a significant one-party rule. And still, at the end of World War II, when those enormous crises passed, and when the Republican Party had been so decimated for a decade that it really had to rebuild, we benefited from pretty good rebirth of the Republican Party. At that point in time, I think being in better shape than it's been in at many other points in time, after having suffered a decade of not being part of our politics. So I think that kind of cleansing of a situation where the parties can completely gridlock each other and make the government dysfunctional through a period of one-party rule, I think would be okay. And I do think that would not be sustainable for any longer than it was in the decade from 1934 to 1944.
So three or four presidential cycles, effectively.
Yeah, I'd say probably three. And, we typically, we had Eisenhower elected, just, only within 5 or 6 years after Roosevelt died. So, Roosevelt was getting elected by 75% of the vote. The Congress was 75% Democratic.
Now, I would say he probably is a little bit of a unique case. I'm not sure if I would use that as an example there, because in large part, historically, both political parties would have been happy to have Eisenhower run for them. He just ended up opting for the Republicans for a couple of maybe not exactly ideological reasons. Just to be brief.
No, but I think that's actually part of my point, that it's only because the Republicans had been so decimated for a decade that they needed to think about how could they start appealing to voters again. And I think that made them open to somebody like Eisenhower because he could win elections. Whereas if they had never been decimated, they would have stuck with much more of the Herbert Hoover types. They wouldn't have been open to a centrist like Eisenhower.
Oh, I see what you're getting at. I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah. So I think it was their very, their political misfortunes that made them go back to the drawing board and try to figure out how to be a party that could actually be attractive to voters in the center, and that the Republicans benefited, from the complete discrediting of Hooverism that kind of created an opening for, what had been their ideology to kind of just die out, and for them to come back as a renewed party that had a great deal to contribute to the country. That could only happen. The Eisenhower could only become their nominee because I think of the abject defeat that they had suffered from the Hoover generation.
I think we probably do have a little bit of disagreement there before we move forward. In that I agree that you don't want to have a system where the opposition is a breakdown, right? As you kind of put it, that rump. Potentially of the Republican Party. I think though I have I appreciate that you call it the second best position when you talk about the one party domination, or having a one party system, excuse me. But I think where I might disagree a little bit is I don't think that was where you see the years of FDR as probably being a better thing. While I'm not as negative on FDR as some, I think that we were saved from some of the more unfortunate FDR pushes, say court packing, for example, because there still was, in fact, an actual loyal opposition from a number of different branches functioning properly as separation of powers. And so I would be hesitant to quite go as far as you are down that path of calling it a second best option. But I recognize that's a shade of difference. But we need to move on to our next topic. But before we're going to do that, we're going to take a short break with a sponsor. And when we come back, we're going to be taking a look at Trump's acquittal, and we're going to focus on some of the upcoming cases that he might still face right after this short break. Well, Ken, we want to chat a little bit about Trump's acquittal. Now, I know that last week we actually had a new individual joining us on the Politics Guys, and both of us had listened in on that one when Olivia joined Mike and Jay. But one of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about in the last show, because they were doing it on a Saturday, was really kind of pushing a little bit deeper into the question of, well, what might Trump now face on the legal side, right? So as we mentioned earlier, McConnell effectively made the argument earlier this week after the vote, again, after they had done the show, saying, look, this is a constitutional issue. I don't begrudge anybody who disagrees or comes on the other side, but you can't impeach a former president. And that was something that we had talked about on the show, the two of us. We obviously came to a slightly different conclusion on that than McConnell. But he will go on to effectively say, I think that he is morally responsible, or the more negative way of looking at this is saying, well, he kicked it to the courts to have to actually deal with it. Now, you might see that's as a bad thing or a good thing. We'll put that to the side for just a minute. But there are still 6 really big cases being laid out. Now, Mike last week, he didn't seem to think that there was much hope here. But I do want to at least list the 6 and kind of get your take, Ken, on what might Trump's future be post acquittal here. One, we've got the ongoing hush money allegations lawsuit. The second big set of cases is the tax and bank fraud investigation that's going on. The third one is we have a big real estate fraud investigation that's going on. We have the emoluments clause, which is the fourth. We've, of course, got the sexual misconduct lawsuit, which is actually a body of lawsuits you might think of as being one or our fifth. And then, of course, one of the other big ones is the Mary Trump lawsuit that's ongoing with Trump. So, Mitch McConnell effectively says, look, this is the way that he's going to be held responsible. And of course, now, I mean, maybe the 7th could even be here. Any of the fallout from what happens from the D.C. incident in the wake of his words. So what do you think is the future? I mean, you're a lawyer, so Trump comes to your office and he plunks down $1 million and he says, hey, what's going on? What do you say to all that, Ken?
Well, first thing is he better plunk down that $1 million, because I'm not going to represent him unless he pays in advance.
Well, that seems to be the case, is that he doesn't always pay, which is, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I have worked around a lot of attorneys. I mean, generally, it's a little bit harder when you haven't paid your bill to get another attorney. But man, every which way Trump seems to turn, there always seems to be some attorney who's like, yeah, I'll take his case up. And I think, what about me? I've got a better case. Take me up. I cannot pay you too.
He offered to pay Rudy Giuliani $20,000 a day to represent him in these cases after the election, and which is a very high fee. It might be one of the highest fees in the country. And then he stiffed him on the whole thing. He didn't pay him any of it.
Here we go, Ken. Here's what I'll do. I promise you right now that if you will take up all the rest of my lawsuits for my life, I will pay you as much money as you want per day, as long as you won't collect.
Right. I think Trump, is, I think he'll be able to escape through some of these lawsuits, but I think he's going to be in big trouble in some of them. He'll probably end up trying to settle. Several of them because he won't want to go to trial. And I also think there's going to be a lot more. In fact, you mentioned at the end, there could be some civil liability arising out of the January 6th insurrection. And I'm quite sure that there will be a lot of cases. I think the first one of those was already filed by Representative Benny Thompson of Mississippi. Yep. He filed a civil lawsuit against Trump and Giuliani for causing the insurrection by the violent mob that broke into the Capitol.
Since you brought him up, can I just ask? I had a question I was going to ask on his particular front. Do you think he's going to actually end up having standing for that suit?
Yeah, I think he will. I mean, there's, I think the question about whether he would stem from a concept called legislative standing, which says that generally, if a legislator, for instance, votes against a bill, argues in Congress that the bill is unconstitutional, and then the bill passes anyhow, and then the legislator wants to go to court and say, ask the court to strike down this law on the ground that it's unconstitutional. Typically, in those kind of situations, the courts will say, well, the legislator doesn't have standing to do that.
Right.
Only someone who's affected by the law. But in this case, he's not suing in his capacity as a legislator. He's suing in his capacity as a person who was in fact violently attacked. Right. So it's not that he's saying my vote somehow was diluted by something Trump did. There'd be standing issues about that. But no, he's saying I had to cower in my office and I could have been killed by this mob that he sent in there. That's a direct particularized injury in fact. So I don't think he should have any problem establishing standing.
Now, I took you down that rabbit hole, so I'm going to bring you back to the original kind of the question. And you were already mentioning there that you thought that Trump could be in trouble for some of these, and obviously try to settle out of court some of these. Although that might be harder in this at this particular stage of his of these trials and what he's done in the past. Where do you think he might have the biggest issues? So obviously one of them, as you've already mentioned, is here the kind of the insurrection activity. What about these other 6?
Yeah. Well, just before we leave the insurrection activity,
please continue.
One more thing I wanted to say about that is, you had some doubts, and I think a lot of judges might share some of those doubts about why Congressman Thompson is the proper plaintiff here. But don't forget, there were some officers killed right there that day.
That's who I thought would probably have the biggest standing. Is I assumed that we would see some lawsuits stemming from their death. That's where I thought we'd have it.
Yeah, we absolutely will. I mean, those haven't been filed yet, but they will be filed. And not only a few killed and a few who committed suicide shortly after, but also I think more than 100 Capitol Police officers were injured that day. And every one of them's got a lawsuit. So, I'm sure there's some of them who won't file, but my guess is you're going to see, upwards of 50 separate lawsuits filed by people who actually sustained injuries or death as a result of that insurrection. And so that's that's a lot of money that's at stake there. And so I think that's probably going to be his biggest single source of civil liability. And I would not rule out criminal liability from that either. I mean, I think one reason that we're not hearing much about that right now is I think that that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to keep themselves a million miles out of those kind of discussions. They're not going to make any decisions about whether to prosecute Trump for the events of January 6th, or probably for anything. I think they're going to leave that all in the hands of the law enforcement. But right now, there may be, that the FBI and career prosecutors may already be doing investigations into Trump's role in all that, but they're properly keeping that confidential, as the Justice Department's supposed to do when it's doing investigating. And Trump always would make a big point of well, we're having the Durham investigation of the investigators, but that's not actually really the way the Justice Department normally operates. Normally if something's at the stage of being investigated, they're not supposed to cast aspersions on people who are being investigated by letting it known publicly that they're doing an investigation. And I think in the end, there's going to be career investigators, career officials finding facts, making confidential reports about whether there's probable cause to bring criminal charges. And then the people on the front lines who are going to have to decide whether to move ahead with that or not are mostly going to be the U.S. attorneys for the particular districts, and primarily the U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia. And not only isn't there one right now, but Biden hasn't even nominated someone to be U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, because I think actually he's going to want to confer with Merrick Garland about that after Merrick Garland's confirmed. And he hasn't been confirmed yet either. So I think
that's a really important point, is I think that we forget that not all of the apparatus of the executive office is nearly in place yet.
Right.
And so when we're having a number of these conversations, I think for a lot of people, there's always a lot of emotion. There's a lot of desire for things to happen really rapidly. But it's not unusual for it to take time to get all these positions filled. And we're not in normal times anyway, because we were already dealing with the trial itself, which of course has delayed some of this. And I'm not saying that's wrong. That's just a function of what's happening.
I do think there was also some obstruction when the Senate couldn't get reorganized after the election, and Lindsey Graham was still running the Judiciary Committee until the Friday before the impeachment trial. That made it harder for Garland to get a confirmation hearing, because traditionally the Attorney General would be one of those positions where there should be a confirmation hearing, ideally even before Inauguration Day, so that they could vote on Inauguration Day or the next day to confirm a Attorney General. But be that as it may, I think that we're only at the stage now where career law enforcement officials would be quietly investigating and would never be in a position to do anything other than present their investigative findings to the responsible superior officials who could make the decision whether to proceed or not. And those officials aren't even on the job yet. So I think it's not surprising we're not hearing anything about criminal prosecution relating from January 6th. But I think it's likely to happen, but it's likely to take a little while, before things start moving forward on that. And then now we can go to some of the other. I slowed you down on that one. But you're asking about some of the other cases as well.
There was nothing slow about it. I mean, there's always. I think that's part of the great thing about having these kinds of conversations is that we both end up focusing on things that might be a little bit different. But so again, the six ongoing, in other words, the ones that were already happening, that package, we have the hush money, we have the tax and bank fraud investigation, the real estate fraud investigation, the emoluments cases. Matter of fact, that one particularly is worth looking at, because the Supreme Court has been unusual in this. I had a question. This is just, I don't even know. And I was curious about this on your case, Ken. Has there ever been a time, because on this set of cases, we've had the longest no response from the Supreme Court over an emergency injunction, I believe, in history, but I wasn't, you always want to be careful saying it's never happened that long, because somebody always comes out and says, well, in 1821, or whatever. But to the best of my ability to get at it, that's been the longest it's been. Do you think that, for example, the fact that we're not hearing from the Supreme Court on that maybe Chief Justice Roberts is trying to kind of, he seems to often try to bring the court together and be that moderating voice so that there's kind of a singular voice moving forward. He did that in the Affordable Health Care Act, for example, seemingly kind of maybe shifting his vote so that he could shift the opinion itself and write it. Do you see any of that happening here, that the court might not be willing to hear these cases? Is that the emoluments clause an example of, well, if they really wanted to take some of this on, wouldn't they have already issued the stay by this point? I mean, again, this is one of the longest that I've seen.
No, you're right. I mean, this Supreme Court has been, I guess there's more than one way of trying to analyze why it's been like this, but this Supreme Court has run a lot of interference that has redounded to the benefit of Trump. They've let him delay proceedings for a very long time, not only in the Emoluments Clause case, but, one of the other ones that I'm just astounded by along those lines is, from the first impeachment of Trump more than a year ago, the House subpoenaed Trump's then White House counsel, Don McGahn. And the question of whether Don McGahn can be made to testify is one that the court has just simply not decided. Mm-hmm. And that's from the first impeachment. That still wasn't even decided by the second impeachment. And that is actually one of the reasons I understand that the House managers, after winning the vote in the second impeachment to allow them to call witnesses, made an agreement not to call any witnesses, because they were afraid the same thing would happen, that the witnesses would refuse to come, and the Supreme Court would run interference by refusing to issue a ruling on that. So I think that kind of interference that the court has been running to just run out clocks in ways that favor Trump, that he's getting away with something because the clock is running out. Do you think that the court
is running out the clock because it wants to favor Trump, or do you think it's running out the clock, and this has been my kind of operating hypothesis, because it doesn't want to have to involve itself in a political question even remotely, and thereby lose some of its reserved status? There is a long-standing history of the court attempting. Now, of course, as you move more recently, the court has eased up on this. Oh goodness, I'm trying to think of. What is the case? They
call it the political question doctrine.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. The idea that there's certain disputes between the political branches that the court should just absent itself from. I think the problem is, I think there's a mixture of motives on the current court, right? So I think that probably, especially now that Justice Barrett is on the court, the center of gravity on the court might be that if they were going to rule on these cases, they would rule in favor of Trump. And so I think because of that, and I do think that's really become cemented by Justice Barrett's ascension to the court, I think that means that the Democrats on the court don't kick and scream too hard if Chief Justice Roberts does these delaying tactics. And I think the delaying tactics from Roberts' standpoint probably are, as you say, to try to preserve the legitimacy of the court in the eyes of the whole country. And not
likewise, you're not setting a precedent. So by saying nothing, you don't set a precedent. We don't know. In a common law system, if you set the precedent, now you have this long-standing practice you got to undo at some point, and that rarely happens.
Yeah, no, I'd actually rather see them set precedents, because I think if they're really going to have a majority vote and rule in favor of Trump in these cases because he's Trump and they're partisans, which is what I believe is where the actual majority of the court is, and I think that's those rulings that Roberts is trying to forestall. I think it's better that they do it, both so that because I don't think they deserve the respect of all Americans if they're that partisan, and also because I think the precedents that they would set with those rulings could also then redound to the benefit of later Democratic presidents. Whereas if they're always just running out the clock because it's Trump and they want to help him, then they might do the opposite when there's a later Democratic president. So I don't really appreciate it, but I think the Dems probably do think it's sometimes better to let the Republicans run out the clock than to actually make terrible rulings. And I think Roberts thinks it's better to run out the clock than to make divisive rulings. And so I think that's I think that there's a kind of overlap of motives there, but they really have not. A lot of those kinds of cases about presidential power, they've made a big point of not deciding them while Trump was president, and they have not invoked the political question doctrine, right? So one thing the court could have done but didn't do is they could have actually issued a ruling saying this is a subject that the court lacks jurisdiction to rule on, and therefore we're not going to rule on it. That's how it's been done in past political question doctrine cases. But the court has never done that in any of these cases. They've just taken the cases, they've exercised jurisdiction over them, and then they just have not decided them.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit different, and I think it's bad, and I wish they would. I actually think they're going to let them run out the clock completely in the Emoluments Clause case, and that the final boom in that case, when the final boom drops, it's going to be that the case is now moot because he's not the president anymore.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. Now, just for my own edification, though, I'm going to have to say the thing that I could not think of when we were talking about the political question doctrine was Luther v. Bourdain.
Yeah,
it was there in my head. I couldn't get it out for the life of me.
yeah, Luther versus Bourdain is the oldest of the political question doctrine cases.
Isn't it the first?
Yeah, the first. Yeah,
that's what I thought. Okay, so I had that right. I was trying to get that out, and it was somewhere in the vaults of my mind.
in case the listeners want to know what that case is, this goes back to the 1840s.
It's 1849, I believe.
So there was actually a revolution within the state of Rhode Island.
Yes,
and there was a military coup.
Do you know why?
I don't know why.
So this is actually a fascinating point of history. So unlike all the other states, Rhode Island had never created its own constitution and instead was still operating off of the royal charter. And so citizens were demanding the legislature either create a state constitution or at least the minimum, get rid of the voting, ownership of land as a voting requirement, and the legislature wouldn't do either. So go ahead, but that's actually what leads to the revolt.
Yeah, what ends up happening is that both factions that claim to be the legitimate government in Rhode Island claim that they hold their own separate elections,
yes.
and they both claim to have won the elections. So there's two different slates of Congress members that show up claiming to represent Rhode Island.
And so the governor declares martial law to try to get the other ones to not be able to show up. Yeah.
And so the Supreme Court is asked to resolve this dispute. And what the Supreme Court says is, well, it's actually Congress that gets to resolve this dispute because in the qualifications clauses of Article 1, each House of Congress gets to judge the qualifications of its own members. And so when people show up claiming to be members claiming to hold the same seat in Congress, the Congress has to decide which one to recognize. Mm-hmm. And because the Constitution assigns that to Congress, which is one of the political branches, the White House being the other political branch, that means that the courts can't make that judgment. And so we sometimes call that the political question doctrine now, that there's certain judgments that have to be made in trial-like settings where we might normally think this is the kind of case or controversy that a court could adjudicate. But if the Constitution actually assigns the resolution of those disputes to one of the two political branches, the legislative branch or the executive branch, then that means that the judicial branch has to stay out. So sometimes that's been used. That's the basis of why impeachment proceedings, for instance, are not judicially reviewable. The Senate has the power to try impeachments, and that means that when there were questions like the one that just came up about whether someone who is no longer in office can be tried in an impeachment trial, the answer would be, well, the court has to stay out of that. That's up to the Senate to decide. And that's why the Senate took a vote on that, and that was not reviewable in court. So that is a doctrine. I don't believe it properly should apply to emoluments clause because the Constitution doesn't say which other branch should decide whether there's been a violation of the emoluments clause. So I think the ordinary presumption that courts can decide that should apply. And the court didn't say that it applies. They actually took jurisdiction over the case and then just sat on it. And so and I think they've done that in several other contexts where they probably should have made a ruling about whether Trump had broken the law or exceeded his authority. But I think they're going to let him run out the clock on the emoluments case. And I think they tried hard to let him run out the clock on the New York district attorney's subpoenas, and it would have worked if he'd been reelected. Because they kept, even while they didn't say he was exempt from subpoenas in state criminal proceedings, they kept sending it back with weird instructions like the state court has to give even more consideration than they did last time to the fact that this guy is the sitting president and that kind of thing. And I think they would have just kept bouncing it back and forth like that for as long as Trump was in office, and soon the statute of limitations would have run out. But because he didn't get reelected, he wasn't able to get away with running out the New York State statute of limitations while he was still in office.
Well, we could talk about that forever, clearly. So I'm going to have to pause this because we've got two more stories for listeners. And when we come back from this short break, so we're going to have a short break and then we're going to come back, and we're actually going to be talking about maybe one of the biggest weather events that has happened in the South in modern history, at least. And that's the cold snap. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the politicization of the cold snap as it dipped into Texas. So if you're going to wait with us just for a moment for our break, and then we'll be back to talk about Texas and the politicization of the cold snap. Well, Ken, there has been a lot of conversation this week about the deeply frigid temperatures, which dipped into the western states. As a matter of fact, I'm part of this, so I've been experiencing it. There was an unprecedented amount of snow and cold even here in the Oklahoma City area where I live. Here in Oklahoma City specifically, we broke a 40-year record. The last time it was the highs were below freezing for this long was the year I was born in 1983. And so, likewise, though, we also beat snow totals. In this case, it wasn't just a 40-year-old weather event. Instead, we actually, for all of recorded history, there has never been as much snow in Oklahoma City as there was over the past few days. But that apparently has not held a candle to what's happening in Texas. And I want to turn to Texas because the Texas power outage, a result of cold temperatures, has become a really big political issue this week. Texas Governor Abbott blamed the Green New Deal and the increasingly high reliance on renewables. On Sean Hannity's Fox News show, he said, quote, "It just shows that fossil fuel is necessary for the state of Texas to make sure we will be able to heat our homes in the winter times and cool our homes in the summer times," end quote. Later in the week, a Wall Street Journal editorial called for more reliance on coal, of all things, instead of either natural gas or renewables because of its reliability, and pointed to the disaster unfolding in Texas. On the left, of course, they blamed a lack of planning, and importantly, a set of officials who have taken themselves off the national power grid. Add into the mix that Ted Cruz was headed to Mexico before he turned around after his daughter tricked him into going, I suppose, on Thursday. AOC shot out on Twitter that Governor Abbott needed to get off TV and read a book on the state's energy supply. So this is one of those items, Ken, where I thought that we as the politics guys could really bring some rational to the debate. And so on Twitter and on the news, I have seen just numbers have abounded about renewables and naturals. And so actually yes, listeners, I went out and I researched this one. So a couple of things just so that we can all be on the same page. One is that yes, Texas does in fact have its own power grid, and it's not completely connected to the rest of the nation's power grid. That grid is called ERCOT, E-R-C-O-T, and it's run by the company of the same name, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. Now, it doesn't actually technically cover all of Texas, but it covers most of Texas. It doesn't include some locations like the Panhandle. Now, further, it's worth noting that the reason that this all happens is that back in 1882, when the very first power grid went on by Thomas Edison, there were lots of smaller companies all around the country. And then during World War I, they got more connected. They got even more interconnected during World War II. And it's during World War II that several Texas companies joined together into the precursor of ERCOT. Now, and this is where things can get very Texan, is the best way I can put this. The Texans wanted to keep their system out of federal control. And so for anybody who wants a little bit more detail on this, because you can't go into all the details in a podcast, I highly recommend there's actually a article in the Journal of Natural Resources and Environment by Richard Cudley, who was a member of the 7th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. He was a Texan, and he kind of outlines this. But what happens in a short version is that Texas went through some deep measures, even through the 70s, to keep their power structure limited. And so eventually there's a truce between Congress and Texas that allowed Texas to continue to have its own level of independence. And so even today in 2021, ERCOT remains beyond the jurisdiction of the Federal Regulatory Commission, and therefore still largely independent of links to other power grids. And that's really unusual. The other thing is there's been all these numbers thrown around. And so I've looked this up too. And so according to the Independent Statistics and Analysis section of the U.S. Energy Information Administration, when you look at electricity consumption, so in other words, the stuff that's actually getting out to people to use, not for other kinds of purposes, and that's what I think is kind of key to this debate here, you can actually list all of, and this is all in thousands of megawatts, the production that Texas has. Natural gas accounts for 15,425 megawatts, again, in thousands. Non-hydroelectric renewables are the next largest, just shy of 9 at 8,913. Coal accounts for 6,539. Nuclear, 3,400. Hydroelectric at 134, and petroleum at a mere 4. So if I've done my math right, and I have, that means that when you're talking about electrics, renewables account for about 25.9% of the electric power grid in Texas, and natural gas accounts for about 44.82%. So I've seen a lot of other outlets get different numbers, and the best I can tell is that these numbers come because they're looking at the pure amount of power coming out as opposed to the power that's going for grid consumption, meaning for consumers. So a lot of the outlets on the left, I think, are kind of really underreporting some of the most meaningful numbers. And on the right, there's just some real lying going on, including that wind turbines have frozen, even though, of course, you can winterize them, and they happen in far northern places. And things like Congressperson Bobart's, you were talking about her earlier, that you have to use planes to de-ice wind, which was actually just a fake bit of a helicopter picture that had nothing to do with that. So here's my question, Ken. In short, Texas, it seems like it froze because Texas doesn't rely on national standards. Natural gas outlets were off, but the percentage of renewables is higher, and it too froze. But in large reason because Texans didn't think this was ever going to happen, and so they just hadn't winterized things. But it hasn't stopped both sides from taking a shot at the other. So what do you think about how quickly the cold snap in Texas, the power outages, have turned into some politicalization? And do you think there's any kind of long-term meaningful statement to be made here?
Yeah, I've been trying to think about this. Justice Louis Brandeis said 100 years ago that one of the great benefits of our system of federalism in the United States is that the states can serve as laboratories of experimentation. And so, I guess the way he would look at this, and maybe I would look at this somewhat this way, is that, it was nice of Texas to, do this radical experiment in deregulation so that those of us in the other 49 states could, see how it works out before deciding whether other states should proceed to do something like this. And,
I was thinking about his saying too, but I thought about it a different way because on the one hand, we have California, which has gone a very different direction as Texas. has had its own set of problems. And then Texas, which thought man, aren't we happy that we're not California? But their fix for it didn't really fix it either, too. It doesn't seem like either major model has worked very well, Ken.
Yeah, well, I don't know, because I guess I know California had issues with high prices, and I don't know if that was also an issue with the fires.
They were having production issues as well. That was one of the issues for rolling blackouts, and that was what I was thinking about more specifically. That's a good point. Yeah. Well, Texas, as you mentioned earlier, the whole state didn't take itself off the national grid. Most of the state did, but El Paso, which has been having exactly the same weather as the rest of Texas, has not had any power outages, and it's because their power comes down through Albuquerque and can come from farther away than that if local plants fail to generate. And it does seem there's some benefits from staying on the national grid if your own plants start to fail you, because you can then get power from other locations.
Which El Paso has been doing just fine, even while it's been just as cold there as in other parts of Texas. The numbers, I actually was looking at the numbers on the ERCOT on their own webpage, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, and the numbers I'm looking at look quite close to what you said, but maybe not exactly. And what I'm seeing here is that and I think these numbers are very close to the ones you said, but they have it listed as 22.8% wind and 45.5% natural gas. So
so in the case for the breakdown, what's going to make it just a little bit different is that I had put together everything that was a non-hydro renewable, and so there's actually a few more when you include that. But
so solar in there.
We're in the same. Yes, we're talking about the same kind of things.
Right, so almost all of that category would be wind, and then just a little bit of it would be solar and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So,
but there is surprisingly some of that in Texas, I have learned. So
some solar, yeah. Well, I guess the thing about wind is, in the politicization of this, my understanding of this, and you could correct me if you know more than me, is that although Texas is pretty heavily into wind, actually 22.8% is both, I think, a lot compared to what you'd see in other states.
In fact, it is way high. Yes, you're correct.
And in fact, it's more than you see for coal being only about 18%, and wind being second again only to natural gas in Texas. But yet, I don't think any of that is because of environmentalism in Texas. I think the reason you see so much use of wind in Texas is because they have a lot of wind in Texas, and they have a lot of space for windmills in Texas. And so these power companies, find it to be economic and in their own self-interest to put up windmills. And I don't think any regulators have come down on them and told them to put down windmills. I think it's there's probably less regulation pushing that kind of thing in Texas than just about any place else in the country. And I don't know if you know anything different than that.
Well, and I'm glad that you pushed us in that direction, because that's where I kind of wanted to take us next. In some ways, this seems like an unforced error for a lot of Texas. So, for example, one of the, and this is, I think, just emblematic of a larger thing that we see coming from Governor Abbott. Because if you look at what he says locally and what he says on the Sean Hannity show, they're different messages. But did you see the message from Tim Boyd, the mayor of Colorado City, Texas? It kind of went viral this past week.
Oh, yeah, Texans would rather have no power than have federal regulation.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, this is the way that he put it. He said, quote, "Let me hurt some feelings while I have a minute. No one owes you." Well, again, I'm cleaning up his language because I can't speak in his English. No one owes you but he means or your family anything, nor is it local government's responsibility to support you during trying times like this. Sink or swim, it's your choice. The city, the country, along with the power providers or other services owes you nothing. I'm sick and tired of people looking for a damned handout. If you don't have electricity, you step up and come up with a game plan to keep your family warm and safe. If you have no water, deal without and think outside of the box to survive and supply water to your family. If you're sitting at home in the cold because you have no power and are sitting there waiting for someone to come rescue you because you are lazy as a direct result of your raising. Only the strong will survive and the weak will perish. What?
Yeah, well, that's
I mean, if he goes on, and I could continue to take on his rant, but I don't mean I am a libertarian here, right? But I don't even, I mean, he's not like, Boyd's not some anarchist who's arguing for the end. I mean, he's not an anarcho-capitalist. What's going on here? I cannot figure out why everybody has, I mean, it's been a bizarre response, and I don't quite have a good answer. You know, you're asking here, well, why is this the attack point? I get why you could have some attack points. I get the Wall Street Journal, but I don't understand a lot of the Texan response. It baffles me.
Well, that's why I started with Justice Brandeis and the laboratory of experimentation, right? I mean, if Texans think that way, you know, if they think, well, we'd rather, we're so committed to deregulation or to unregulation of businesses that we're perfectly willing to run the risk that our businesses can't supply essential services, because it's better to let power companies have bad days where they can't provide power than to actually regulate them to make sure that they can provide power. You know, I'd say it's instructive for Texas to experiment like that and let the rest of the country see that.
You keep putting in that framework, and on this I'm going to push back a little bit. It's not even so much about regulation in that, okay, you made some choices that were probably undoubtedly a little bit cheaper, and I think a lot of people make those, and I get that. Who would have planned for the freeze and the snow on the beaches of the Gulf of Mexico? I don't think that's going to be.
That's not true. They did, but they had. I mean, when President Obama was still president, in 2011.
Oh no, I'm not saying that you couldn't have predicted, but I don't think anybody's going to put the money into that. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I mean,
it's kind of like people recognize they need to save for retirement, but it doesn't mean anybody does.
No, but these are closely regulated industries in most states, and a regulator in any normal state would order them to do that, because they shouldn't be able to make choices here that are only purely in the power company's own self-interest. The regulator could force them to do some things that will protect the public interest. And
like
in Texas,
yeah.
Yeah. And I guess in Texas, they're saying, they don't want to do that. So fine. But I'm glad I live in a state where it gets cold all the time. And the regulator will actually say, the regulator will say to the power company, you have to insulate those gas lines so that the gas doesn't freeze in the line. And, that's just a cost of doing business in this state if you're running a power company. And that's how it is in almost every state. So Texas is really taking a unique regulatory experiment here. And I was going to say in 2011, they had this kind of weather in Texas. I mean, this is a little bit worse this time, but they had enough cold weather in 2011 that they had all the power, the gas lines froze. The power went out for about 24 to 36 hours, a lot of places in the state. And, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, when it was still Obama's Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they told the Texas regulators, they said, look, we don't have authority over you, but they sent them a plan, and they said, you should tell the power companies in Texas that they have to put some insulation around the gas lines, because those gas lines are going to freeze again the next time it gets this cold, and then you're not going to be able to get gas to the power generating plants. I mean, it's not like they weren't told that. It's just that they decided that they didn't care and they weren't going to regulate their power companies.
Well, I mean, yes, I won't disagree on that point. No.
Yeah, so I say good. Let them show the rest of the country what it's like to have that kind of regulatory philosophy.
Okay, so now, Ken, we have gone long in this show. We've got one other really big item that we need to take care of. And this one is near and dear to you, Hart. It's COVID Relief Bill Part 3, right? I mean, we got to talk about this. And as a matter of fact, on this Friday, House Democrats, their $1.9 trillion bill's full text was made available for COVID relief. It includes a number of items. It's not a big surprise for anybody who actually wants to read through it. The only kind of moderate surprise might be that the House Democrats are still sticking by the $15 an hour minimum wage. Includes the $1,400 direct checks for Americans making less than $75,000 a year, an extension of unemployment benefits. I have yet to be able to see if they've included the idea of extending the child tax credit. That was not readily apparent to me on my brief read through. So what I do want to focus on, though, is this is huge. I mean, this is 1.9 trillion, and this is in addition to the already 3.5 trillion spent on COVID relief. As we talked about earlier on the show, this is actually something weirdly that former President Trump wanted. He wanted to have another relief bill, but specifically wanted higher direct payouts. As a matter of fact, he blamed Mitch McConnell for not getting that done. So if we add these bills together, if this in some form 1.9 trillion goes forward about at the size that it is, that means we're going to be hitting $5.4 trillion in new spending. So, Ken, my question is this. I get that Democrats want to expand relief, but are we getting into some historic territory when it comes to spending? And when I say historic, I want to put this in context. The mandatory budget in 2021 for the U.S. government alone was $2.966 trillion. And that's a number that many analysts already thought, myself included, was pretty worrisome. These bills outspend significantly just the mandatory budget. As a matter of fact, these three bills are spending close to twice that amount on COVID relief. That even outpaces outlays for defense. Another way to look at it is if you take a look at the fiscal year of 2019, the federal budget came out less than just the COVID relief. So the for fiscal year of 2019, total government spending was $4.448 trillion. We had a budget deficit on that of just shy of $1.984 trillion. The COVID relief bills in totality will be more in spending than the entire federal budget in 2019 alone. So, Ken, I know a lot of times, and this has been a point that you've made, Democrats say, look, one of the big problems is that we need to have individuals who are willing to both spend but have corresponding tax increases. But I don't see any Democrats talking about these in terms of how we're going to pay for it, especially given that we're talking about numbers that far outpace even total government spending in the past. Democrats often blame Republicans for being the tax cut and spend party, but are we watching Democrats become the spend party? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I share some of your concerns about the economics of this. But this will be the show where I keep saying we're in second best world. I think
so. This is the second best. Okay.
Second best solution, right? Because I think you're right that it actually spends more than it should, with less less targeting than would be ideal, and really very little idea about how it's going to impact the federal budgets going forward.
So you would agree with me on this? I'm curious because again, I don't want to cut you off, but you would agree they should have some spending. They need to have some either spending cuts or some taxing increases as part of this bill. You agree with that?
No, this is what I'm going to say.
Okay.
I agree with the economics of your analysis, but not with the politics of it. I think they just need to pass this bill as is, even though I think I think it's running some risks with the economy, but I think the political risks on the other side are just too great, because they. So I do think they need to pass the bill as is, because it's not the bill that would be my ideal bill, but we're in a situation here again where they're being forced to use the budget reconciliation process, which is a non-filibusterable process, because there's no Republicans actually willing to negotiate in good faith, or not enough Republicans willing to negotiate in good faith that they could come up with a bipartisan relief bill in the ordinary course that wouldn't be filibustered. And the reconciliation process can only be used a limited number of times a year. And so if they're going to burn one of their times using it, they need to think of they need to go very big, because they can't come back and do more.
Don't you think very big is an understatement? Again, we're talking bigger than an entire fiscal year.
Yeah. But the thing is, I don't think it's a great use of money to give $1,400 to virtually every American. But Biden promised it on the campaign trail, particularly for the Georgia Senate seats, right? And so I think he needs to deliver on the promise, because he promised it, and I think people voted for him on that basis. And so we're not really on a blank slate here, where the question is, what's the best way to spend?
But for example, he could still keep that promise and bring this bill in well lower than it is right now, and maybe at least have total COVID spending under a whole year worth of spending. I mean, I get what you're saying about, hey, I want to keep my promises, but is he keeping his promises on the backs of like my children's inability to actually make money and pay? I mean, we're talking about a historic amount of debt. So that means that the deficit, if we're doing these projections right, if the deficit will be larger than all of these bills. In other words, our deficit spending for the first time in history would be multiples of trillions. Even when you're talking this in terms of real dollars, that's not even World War II spending. We're surpassing that.
Well, but it's not going to be your children. I mean, if it has a negative impact on the economy, it's probably going to be felt in the form of inflation in the next year or two. I don't think it's I mean, our parents' generations engaged in some deficit spending, and somehow we're still paying lower taxes than they did. I don't think it's the idea that there is deficit spending means that anyone's children are going to have to pay for it, because right now today, for instance, I think about 8% of the federal budget is spent on interest on the debt. And about 22% of the federal budget is paid for by new borrowing. So it's always going to be possible to keep borrowing more to pay. And you
say that as if but eventually you can't do that, right? As a matter of fact, we know the points at which countries. I mean, this is something that's been economically, you can just work it out, where when your spending and borrowing surpass a certain level of your entire budget, and this would, I mean, a lot of times you have this question of like, well, how much this puts us near some of those levels of other countries, changing potentially even our rating status. So, I mean,
I don't think so. I don't think it could change. I mean, the United States is not similarly situated to small countries. We're the reserve currency for the world. We're a place that a lot of people want to invest in. We did, in fact, have years, as you mentioned, during World War II, where the deficit was larger than the amount of revenues that were raised. So we were running deficits of more than 100%. And it didn't really, in fact, we had pretty good economies in the years after the war when that deficit dropped some. But
of course, we had far higher tax rates. And that's where I think Democrats are letting us down, right? One of the ways that was possible was you had a massively different tax base and a different tax structure. So, I mean, well, here's the libertarian telling the Democrat, hey, wait a second, you're doing this during a different type of revenue raising than you did during World War II, for example.
But there's going to be some tax reform. I mean, I'm not going to say it's going to be enough to pay for all this in the short run or anything, but
or the medium run or the long run or.
Well, right. I mean, probably never in the long run either, but I don't think it matters to pay it all off in the long run. And we've been managing to get by for about 75 years without paying off debt in the long run. And
it still doesn't mean you should buy a Mercedes, though. I mean,
well. But again, the way the reconciliation rules work, technically, the filibuster-proof procedures can be used once each fiscal year for one spending bill, for one separate taxing bill, and for one separate bill to lift the debt ceiling. Now, this year there may be able to be two of each because fiscal year 2021 actually started back on October 1st of 2020,
which is normal. Yep.
Yeah, and none of those bills were ever done for this fiscal year. So I think there can be, the reconciliation can still be used for a spending bill, a taxing bill, and a debt ceiling bill once for the current fiscal year, and then once more during the current fiscal year for the next fiscal year. So maybe they get two shots, but I think that the tax bill will be a different one. And just like Trump in 2017 came in and used the tax reconciliation process to do the tax cut bill in 2017 with no Democratic votes, I think the Dems are going to do that, and Biden has been talking about raising the income tax rate on corporations and the income tax rate on individuals who earn more than $400,000, and maybe doing something to reduce the disparity between the capital gains tax rate and the ordinary income tax rate. I mean, Biden has definitely been talking about some targeted tax increases, and I'm quite sure that's coming. Now, whether whether that's going to add up to the kind of money that this stimulus bill is costing. I'm sure it won't, but the tax bill will remain in effect, for years. And the stimulus bill right now seems to be a one-time deal. I mean, I guess this is the second time.
Third time deal. Third.
Yeah, but the middle one was much smaller, and I think the first one was actually larger than this one. But we are going to come near the end of the pandemic. I mean, already about 1 out of every 8 people in the country has already been vaccinated. I think by the end of summer, the expectation is that substantially everybody who wants to be vaccinated will be vaccinated, and I think you will see so many businesses reopening and so many jobs opening up again that nobody will be talking about another stimulus bill like this in another 6 months. So I think tax increases have a longer period of time to collect revenues than this stimulus bill is going to be spending revenues. So I think things will come back into balance a bit, or at least be moving in the right direction. And I wouldn't really believe in the parade of horribles about that this is going to turn into Greece or something and the whole thing is going to collapse. I mean, this is the United States.
I don't think the whole thing is going to collapse. I hate that point, but I think that your analysis that you can kind of have an endless spend is a long-standing Democratic trope that ignores some of the real economic evidence. And as a matter of fact, I'm in some ways I'm happy, as a matter of fact, that the Democrats are going to do it via reconciliation, because I do not think that this will go down in history as a good one, and I think the Democrats are going to have to end up owning it. My only real question is I hope that Republicans can capitalize on it in a positive way in 2022 and 2024 and not allow it to help Trump. But I think that in some ways that Trump party. But no, I think Democrats are going to end up having to eat this one. And I think that your idea of it's just a little bit more spending, it can't have any harm. It is just an example of, you agree with me and you say it's kind of second best, but let's be honest, Democrats can force through whatever they want to. So they could force through a good bill. They're choosing not to force through a good bill because why? There's no reason.
No,
they don't need Republicans. They don't need a single Republican.
Because they can only do this limited number of times. So for instance, they could do a bill where they just give everybody $1,400. If it were possible to come back later and do a bill to save the post office, and if it were possible to come back later and do a bill to
right.
To
so
help
they're
state and local
throwing in
governments.
tons of spending items that they cannot pay for in a historically large bill,
Right.
totally with their own votes, and they know it's a bad bill, and you're admitting it's a bad bill. So you guys got to eat it. That's what's going to happen down the pipe.
For one thing, I think it's I don't say it's a bad bill. I say it's a second best bill, and I think it's better. It's worth doing on balance because it does a lot of things that need to be done and that won't otherwise be possible to do unless they do it right now as part of this bill.
It is different than Congress. Listen, this is Congress saying in one particular month we're going to spend our yearly budget, more than our yearly budget, but somehow that's going to work out. That is insanity. There's no universe in which any normal human being gets to spend their entire year's budget in a month and say, hey, that's not going to cause some kinds of problems. Now, does that mean that the economy is going to collapse? Of course not. We don't have to be, the Pauls of the world and say, hey, look, we need to be in a gold standard. But I mean, listen, on the left and the Democrats, you guys have got to recognize that's not a second best. That's a disastrous bill.
Well, what's the disaster? I'm sort of still missing what you think the harms are going to be.
Okay, let's be honest. If none of the money spending mattered, why not just spend an infinite amount of money every particular year? I mean, clearly you'd find that to be ridiculous, right?
No, I'm not saying no harms will happen, but I think, if say we've had years where inflation has been pretty low, like 1%, so let's say next year, because all this money's floating around, inflation goes to 2 or 2.5%. I think that's a harm, but I think the harms are outweighed by the benefits of doing the bill when you include both, the fact that some things really need to be done, like say the post office really needs to be bailed out. It would be much more of a harm if the post office failed yield than if inflation went up a little bit. And in other cases, I think, political promises
I think you're
were made.
underestimating the amount. So when you say, oh, it's just going to be inflation a little bit, I mean, again, at the rate that we're talking here, if you go back, we're not talking about inflation increasing maybe 1% or 2%. We're talking more in the range of 3 and 4%. And that's, again, when you're starting to get into those areas where we can see, economically speaking, that this has long-term harms. So, for example, to people's long-term savings, right? So you can say, hey, that's only even in your particular estimate, let's say we put it at that 2.5%. That means that individuals who are saving and trying to get done for retirement now have to do a 2.5% more per year for their earnings in order to be able to save. I mean, you're talking about actual working class human beings, and it's a secondary back tax that they're all paying. And they're paying a tax on the backside. That's the truth.
The stock market's been doing better than 10% a year. People saving for retirement are not going to be that badly harmed if inflation goes up a little bit. And I'm one of them. I'm 55 years old. But
but
money
you have to be honest. Then that is in fact a harm on those people, and it's an invisible harm. And that's why that's the reason Democrats are doing it this way. It's because they don't have to raise taxes. They can have an invisible tax on a bunch of people who don't realize what this means as a compound interest over their savings over time. So what you're advocating for here is that you're saying, look, Joe Biden has to keep this promise, and the way he's going to keep this promise is by having an invisible tax on individuals, and that way he can push it through without actually having to talk about the real thing. Democrats could raise tax, put it part of this deal, but they're not doing that because they'd rather have it at the back end. They don't want to take it. They don't want to take responsibility for historic spending increases.
No, I think that's wrong on both counts. For one thing, I was being honest about it. I'm the one who raised the issue of inflation. My point is that I think that will happen, but that I think the benefits outweigh the harms that the small amounts of inflation will cause. And then the other thing is that a lot of the people who are being benefited by, to the extent that the people are getting $1,400 checks, a lot of the people getting those checks right now are people who actually are either having, out of work or having reduced incomes or having a hard time making ends meet. And so they really actually need the money to live on. And that's actually more important to them. And I do think 75 grand cap is still a little high, but I think for some people who are making less right now, they're really in a situation where they need the emergency aid, and that's more important than being very vigilant about inflation. So I think there's costs and benefits here. But I think when you're counting the costs, there's also costs of doing too little. Obama was only able to do too little in 2009, and it caused a much slower recovery than there might have otherwise been. And I think government has to be seen as actually delivering results to people to restore some of the faith in government. And to the extent that government can do that right now, that's beneficial. And finally, I did say I do believe the Dems are going to raise taxes. I think that's part of the plan. It's just not part of this bill. But that's actually normal to do that in a separate bill.
Well, I mean, I'm on board as long as you're going to try to make the ends meet. But I think that I think you are downplaying some of the harms. And I think this is an example of, I oftentimes hammer on Republicans for wanting to cut taxes, but not actually pay for those tax cuts. And on the other side, this is the same kind of thing. Small amounts of tax increases will not pay for a 1-year spending in 3 bills. And so to say that even at the most minimal level of harm, you're talking about a particular back-end tax. And I think the reason both parties do this is something that Mike and I have talked about too, is because it's politically expedient. It's a way of doing what you're suggesting. It looks like government's doing good. At the same time, they're not actually paying the bill, but they're going to pay the bill. But they're paying the bill in an invisible way, in a dishonest way, in my opinion. Because they don't want to pay for it on the upfront. And so, maybe I'll eat my words if later in the year Democrats move the needle either on some spending items and cut those back in a way that helps pay for this, and or they meaningfully raise taxes in a way that's it's going to even take a bite out of this. But I doubt it.
I think that, if you look at 1.9 trillion spent now plus about 3.6 trillion
it ends up being
spent.
4.448 trillion for all 3 bills together.
Yeah. Yeah, so no, I agree with you. They're not going to raise taxes to collect $4.4 trillion more dollars in a year, but I think they're going to raise taxes, by maybe to collect maybe somewhere between a tenth and an eighth of that amount more in a year, and those increases are going to stay in effect, at least until the Republicans come back and take control and reduce them again, and there isn't going to be a need for stimulus spending like this every year. And in fact, tax revenues may go up by even more than just the amount of tax increases, because you're going to have a lot of businesses coming back online after the pandemic and paying taxes again. You're going to have a lot of people going back to work and paying taxes again. So I think revenues would just naturally go up even without a rate increase. And I do think you're going to see rate increases on corporations, on people who earn more than 400 grand, and on capital income.
Well, I guess we're going to end there because we are coming quickly to the end of our show. Goodness gracious. Ken, it's been a lot of fun doing the show, and I want to thank all of our listeners for being part of the Politics Guys. I know that all of the hosts, myself included, love working on the show. It's truly a labor of love. We wouldn't be doing it right now if it wasn't. But to make this all possible, it takes the support of amazing listeners like you. And one of the ways you can help the show is by subscribing to the Politics Guys on our podcast app of your choice. And so does sharing episodes. It's one of the best kinds of advertising we have. But we also need your support. One of the great things about being a supporter is you get access to supporters only content, which includes another full length show. You thought this one was long. Just wait till you get to our bonus show where Ken and I debate something else. No, actually, we're going to take on in this bonus show, we're going to be taking on your questions. And one of the new things that we have for supporters is a Discord channel. And I'm going to be honest, I have not been as active in the Discord channel as I've hoped. Discord, I'm a social media guy, but Discord has been difficult for me, but I was getting into this. And so a number of the questions we actually got today, because I was reaching out to our Discord channel. So if you want to be part of that Discord channel, maybe get your questions here on this show, we'd love for you to be able to chat with myself or with Mike and gain access by becoming a supporter. So maybe you want to be a supporter. You want to be able to listen to our listeners only content where Ken and I take on your questions here in just a moment. If you want to do that, you can actually head to the Politics Guys webpage or check out our Patreon page. So again, if you head to patreon.com/politicsguys, you can support the show there, or you can head directly to politicsguys.com/support. So you can join myself and Ken again on the bonus show this Wednesday by heading to patreon.com/politicsguys. The other really cool thing is I know that Mike put out a call and we were trying to raise some funds for a new editing machine for him. And we've already met that. And we used another new tool, which was Vimeo. And so you can also support the show via Vimeo. So if you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you'd like to share, you can always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of The Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Morano, Andra Masker, Nathan Salznowski, Daniel Toe, Chris Wilkinson. Today's show was produced by myself, Trey Orndorff. We'll be back with a new show next week. I hope you'll join us then.